So we are celebrating 30 years that the Elfin Forest has been in existence. And we are very proud of the amount of work and time that volunteers have contributed over the years to this. And I'm going to start off with clarifying a little nomenclature, that the original organization was known as the Small Wilderness Area Preserves. And that's what it was incorporated originally. But shortly thereafter, it got changed because I think there was some confusion that people thought perhaps they were making jellies and jams from wild places. And it's always been abbreviated as SWAP, which has been somewhat confusing because what is SWAP? Is it a swap meet? So recently, back in 2020, the group that is represented here decided to do business as the Friends of the El Morro Elfin Forest. So we are still legally SWAP. And you can make checks to SWAP, you can make checks to FEMEF. But we are now have a name that really represents what we do. But you may wonder why we had to drag it out and stick the El Morro in there. Well, traditionally, this area was known as El Morro, the area that became Baywood and then eventually into Los Osos. But the real reason that we had to put that there is that we are not the only elfin forest in California. Down in Escondido in San Diego County, there is also an elfin forest. They call theirs the Elfin Forest Recreational Reserve. And they are very similar to us. They have the same plant communities that we do. The coast live oak is their dominant plant, but they are almost 800 acres. We are 90 acres. So, and they have 11 miles of trails for hiking, biking, and horses. So that's why the El Morro is really important in our name. And let's start with the early history of the Elfin Forest. Starting way back with the Chumash people were in this area for 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. And starting in year about 1220 up to 1565, there has been archaeological evidence of the Chumash in the actual Elfin Forest. And the surveys that were done, there were multiple archaeological surveys done. They weren't done really digging deep. They were more surface, but they did pick up on the middens, the shells. And those are from temporary encampments that were done in the springtime. So there was never a village in the Elfin Forest, but they would come and camp in the spring, and they would collect shellfish, the oysters and the clams. They would do fishing. They'd hunt for small animals. They'd maybe make a few tools. There were some chipping flakes and broken projectile points found in the surface in those surveys. So then we have the Spanish arriving in the area. And Cermeno put into Estero Bay very early on. In 1769, the Portola expedition came through, and they came in through a valley that they named Canada de los Osos. And so that's where our community has gotten the name Los Osos. 1772, the mission was established in San Luis Obispo. And then in 1842, the first Spanish ranchero grant was made to a Victor Linares, and he promptly sold it a couple years later, and it's been sold many times down the line. But that was the first rancho in our area that was sold. And here's an old plat map. It's a little hard to see that here is the Estero Bay and probably the Baywood area right around here. You can't see probably all the way up where the Elfin Forest was. Now, I'd like to introduce you to a woman named Emily Polk. And if it were not for Emily Polk, we probably would not have an Elfin Forest today. And she was a real Renaissance woman. She was a conservationist, an artist, a poet, an author, interior designer, a world traveler, and fashion designer. And she and her husband moved to Los Osos in 1969. And they had a house on a street off of Bay Oaks Drive up by the fire station, the street that runs behind the mobile home parks on Los Osos Valley Road. And they loved to explore nature. They did a lot of hiking in their neighborhood. And back in 1969, there weren't a whole lot of houses around them. And they found this interesting, really unique gully that they climbed down into, and it had these giant oak trees with all these twisted branches. And they just thought it was a wonderful, magical place. And a couple years later, Emily was horrified to find that that property was posted for development and was about to become a mobile home park. So naturally, she was really horrified and wanted to do something about it. She decided that they needed a plan. And in her mind, the plan, I'll show you in a minute, but she really planned it out. And she gathered other conservationists to help out to accomplish saving that property. So in 1971, she founded the Small Wilderness Area Preserves. It was incorporated in California as a nonprofit corporation, which is really critical because if you want to raise money, you want to be a nonprofit so that you don't have to pay taxes on the money that people give you. And the principles that this was founded on was land acquisition for neighborhood places, for environmental ed for kids, sanctuaries for wildlife, and just breathing space for people in urban areas to promote natural awareness and relationships, and lastly, as a means to raise the funds to acquire real property that can be held in perpetuity for the foregoing purposes. And the board of directors that she put together initially, the people that signed the papers of incorporation, included these people. And everybody looks at Ansel Adams and goes, whoa, yes, indeed, that Ansel Adams. She had lived in the Bay Area and knew a lot of movers and shakers, and she was able to get in contact with him. He probably never saw the Elfin Forest. He died in 1984, which is the period where we were just really starting to get the property for the Elfin Forest. But however, he was in the county, San Luis Obispo County, several times back in the 50s and 1960s. If you Google Ansel Adams and put in Oceano Dunes, you'll find one of his photographs. So he didn't know that there was a unique place here. Margaret Owings was a well-known conservationist of the time. She lived out in Big Sur. Edgar Wayburn was the president of the National Sierra Club for several years in a row. And of course, Emily. So that's the foundation of the swap that got us to where we are now. So that first acquisition was the Los Osos Oak State Reserve. And that's one of the trees down there. And you can see they're a little different than the trees in the Elfin Forest. It has a much more vertical growth to it, that our trees kind of spread out and sprawl along the ground. The way they got this property is she had her husband, who was at Cal Poly, contact some of his tax in different areas of biology and come out and do an inventory of all the resources that were there. They lobbied in Sacramento, and they got donations from a big donor, Dart Industries, and also they tapped into the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a big national fund for these kinds of purposes. And the really interesting thing is she did this all in 1 year. Can you imagine trying to do that to save a parcel of property in this day and age? But she was very persistent. And if you go into the Los Osos Preserve these days, you go over the bridge and a little bit to the right, there's a little small stone monument, and this brass plaque is on it, noting that the Dart Industries helped contribute to the purchase of that land. So how SWAP'd work, as it was an umbrella. It was something that sheltered a bunch of chapters under it. And each chapter had a specific goal, a specific piece of property they were interested in. And SWAP Inc., the umbrella, shared all their fundraising experiences with their chapters. Chapters had to pick up a lot of their small expenses on their own. And from the very onset, the goal was to secure the property and then turn it over to some kind of public agency that could take care of it afterwards. And when the goal was achieved, the chapter could move on to a new goal, or very often they just dissolved. So chapters in California, there's a whole laundry list of chapters there. I wasn't able to find a lot of good information on this because when Emily Polk died, she donated all her papers to the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. And so we don't have a lot of those records, but if I found it on a pamphlet that had been published or a newspaper article or whatnot, I listed those here. I think Emily eventually would have liked to do this nationally, but after about 10 years, she and her husband moved abroad and were gone for overseas for about 10 years. So I think that kind of lowered the momentum of things. That we have the Estero Coast chapter, which was locally in this area, and of course our own current Los Osos Morro Bay one. There was a North Coast one at one time, the Fiscalini Ranch. They eventually broke off before they succeeded in their goal and under a different name, but they started there recently. And there were a couple of others in San Luis Obispo. Today, the only chapter that exists is the Los Osos Morro Bay chapter. So we've just kind of merged with the SWAP Inc., and it's all one organization now. So the Estero Coast chapter was the first chapter in this area. And here's a really old map that I found. And this is the Los Osos Creek here. You can see the sort of point down in Baywood here. There's the Elfin Forest in there. If you look back 50 years or more ago, if you're driving on South Bay Boulevard to Morro Bay, all that property on the right was ranch land. That was not Morro Bay State Park. It's only been in the last 50 years that was added. So the Estero chapter organized in 1973, and they operated under another umbrella, which was the Alliance for the Morro Estuary. And that group had a lot of other groups in it. It had Audubon, it had Native Plant Society, it had the League of Women Voters, it had the Sierra Club. So it was a very big and powerful group. And they facilitated the purchase by the state of California of the two properties here, the Baptista property and the Griffith property. So this is not all the way to Twin Bridges, but partway up the Baptista. And then you can also see the auto property here, which is what became the Elfin Forest. So no problem getting the Baptista and the Griffith. With the auto property, it got very ugly. There were suits, countersuing. The state condemned the property. It was a real mess. But since the state had originally offered to buy the property, the Estero chapter thought it was finally going to go through, and they disbanded thinking that it had been saved. That brings us to the Los Osos chapter. They were the second chapter in the Estero Bay area. And I'm going to divide this into two parts because there's actually two parts of the property. So in 1981, it was a real surprise to the neighborhood when there were posts at the end of the street ends that the property was going to be developed, and there were even some lots that were plotted out. And so a group of neighbors, including Yolanda Waddell, who is here today, right there, and Pat and Larry Grimes, there, same table also, and they formed a group called Save Morro Bay that was just not really knowing how to go about it, how they're going to raise all this money. And someone from Morro Bay came over, and I suspect that he was probably associated with the Estero Bay chapter at one point, but again, can't really find any good documentation to that. But anyways, someone came to them and recommended that they form a chapter under SWAP because they weren't really aware of SWAP, and that would give them a lot more leverage to be able to secure the property. So in 1985, they applied to SWAP. They were accepted. And they were really lucky because they lobbied an assemblyman, Eric Seastrand, and he got a bill passed that would purchase the 51 acres on the north, which was wonderful, except the fund that he mentioned in his bill had already been depleted of money. So, but smart guy, he went ahead, and in the following year, he got the funds stuck into the state budget, and the northern 51 acres were secured. There was a dedication held in June of '88, and he attended that, and it was a big success. However, there was still 38 acres that generally these days we round it to 50 and 40, but it was fractional, so I'm being technical here, that they were still up for development. And so the local chapter sprang into action and raised the $1.6 million. And they probably were not likely to get money from the state again, so they had to do their own fundraising. And a very important thing they did was applying for multiple grants. And they applied for grant after grant. And many times they would hear, you want all that money for only 38 acres? That's kind of a waste. We could do so much more with that money somewhere else. So they kept doggedly at it, and we'll see if they got grants. They held concerts down in the Elfin Forest. They sold all kinds of stuff. And they even sold square footage. One year in the fall before Christmas, they said, you know, you can buy a stocking stuffer for somebody and buy them several square feet of the Elfin Forest. And then they also had, you could get a deed of stewardship to the Elfin Forest. So they were very, very creative. And another thing that was a big fundraiser was the mural that was done in 1994 on the side of the Rexall drugstore. This was designed and painted by Barbara Rosenthal, and it is still there today. It's been renewed a little bit and brightened up. And what's really cool, if you go down there and you look here at this corner, there is a panel there listing over 2,000 people, everybody that donated through this fundraiser to get to that point. Everybody's name is on there. So if you did that, but like I say, there's quite a few. I think they're alphabetical by first name. You have to really look to find yourself. And so here's the breakdown. They were successful on getting two really major grants, one from the Environmental and Enhancement Mitigation and one from the Transportation Enhancement Activities Grant. Big complicated grants, but you can see basically what they were meant to do. They got $200,000 from the Coastal Conservancy, $100,000 from the state lands, and everybody locally made up about $250,000 to get that property. And then the county made up the difference and put in $53,000. However, the county put some strings attached to that money. The supervisor was Bud Laurent, and he was aware of how unique that property was and how it really needed to be well taken care of and not just turned over to the county parks. So they had to come up with a management plan, and SWAP had to write that, and they had to make an adopt a park contract. So the adopt a park contracts have been done since the beginning, since 1994. They used to be 10 years, now they're down to 5 years, and our current contract is up in next year, and we'll have to renew that. And the current contract talks about weed abatement, revegetation, trimming of vegetation along the boardwalk and the designated trails. If we did not do that, that boardwalk would disappear because the forest would keep growing. So we trim the plants back. We don't kill any of the plants, but we trim off some of the edges. We also try and block some of the oak groves so that people don't get in there. And a big one we do is performing minor repairs to the boardwalk. The county will supply the wood and the screws, and we provide the labor. For many years, one of our longtime board presidents, Ron Rasmussen, did it, and now one of our co-conservation chairs, Jeff Riffle, is doing the repair work on the boardwalk. And that boardwalk is now 25 years old. And that's a long time for it's out of treated Douglas fir. And it's lasted for 25 years because every time there's a cracked board, we take it out and replace it. It took 3 years to do it because remember, they got the property in '94 to put together a comprehensive management plan that started off documenting everything that was there, the physical, cultural, and biological recreational resources, provided guidelines for management both by community volunteers in coordination with county staff, and proposed some of the projects that should be done, like revegetation, erosion control, removal of invasive plants, and building an accessible boardwalk. So moving on to the boardwalk, one of the good things about the boardwalk is it reduced some of the impact on the middens so that people weren't trampling on those shell pieces and breaking them down even further, and protecting the plants and animals, but also to allow people of all abilities to be able to get out in that forest and appreciate the nature. So that was designed by an architect, Mark Darris, who is sitting right over there. Give him a hand. And he designed it with tow rails so that a wheelchair or a stroller wouldn't roll off. A blind person with a cane could tap along that. And he built in level sections about every 30 feet or so, was it? So if you were pushing your wheelchair or somebody was pushing your wheelchair for you, there was a flat place that you could rest and not have to put the brake on or worry about rolling away downhill. And the benches, Mark also built all the benches. So if you've been there and sat on a bench, you've sat on one of Mark's benches. So. And that really helps because even little kids get tired and need to take a break. So the benches benefit everybody. That was constructed by the California Conservation Corps and supervised by James Taylor. We called him JT. And there's Mark out supervising when it was being built. And over here, this is JT. And then we've got a couple, you can see how it curved through the plants so that we didn't have to destroy any plants. Here's this is the platform that's at 16th Street. And there are some of the benches that are scattered at regular intervals through the forest. And a late addition in 2011, we put a bulletin board up along the edge of the boardwalk. And one of our volunteers, Barbara Renshaw, changes that display every month and puts up pictures of things that are new that are happening at that particular time, and also promoting our monthly nature walk. So this is an overview map of the Elfin Forest and the boardwalk. That the dividing line between the property that is actually state parkland is right about there. So the whole loop of the boardwalk is within the county parks area, and Sienna's View is actually on state land. Most of their 51 acres is mudflats. They've got a little bit of the riparian edge along the sand dune, but the county is mostly where all the activity is. You can see how many benches there are, and at the end of every street, there is a trail into the boardwalk. The 16th Street has the accessible wooden boardwalk in, and all the rest are sand trails. So some other things have happened over the years in the meantime, but in 2003, it was decided that there needed to be a recovery plan, because although this land had never been plowed for agriculture, it had never been grazed by animals, there had been some damage by people going in with motorcycles and ATVs and tearing around a little bit. So there did need to be some replanting done. So here's a before picture, and this looks like a field of wheat. This is actually veldt grass in the fall, and there is an ocean of it there in that. And here is basically the same view after it was revegetated. And you can see that there's a real wide variety of natural plants there, and not one big invasive sprawl. This picture, I believe Larry Grimes took this picture. This is where Bush Lupin Point Outlook is right now today. And you can see tire tracks. You can see big ice plant here. And that area got really torn up. Here is the Bush Lupin Outlook right there, and the boardwalk leading up to it. So the revegetation was pretty much a big success. That it included erosion control with straw wattles. The seed that was used was actually collected on site. We didn't go to some native plant store and buy plants that weren't uniquely subspecies of this area. So seeds were collected, they were propagated by casting them or planting seedlings, they were manually watered. But the very first set of plants that were put out, everybody was really excited. They went the next day to look at them, and they were all gone. Deer? Absolutely gone. Rabbits. Probably deer too, but the bunnies. We've got a lot of bunnies. And I notice them, particularly in the spring, they come out and eat all the tender new shoots on all the plants. I've seen them knock over Dudleya to eat the flowers off of them. So after that, the plants that went out, they went out with a chicken wire enclosure to protect them. And so there were priorities for rare plants, plants to restrict access. If you don't want somebody to go into an oak grove, plant a fuchsia flowered gooseberry. They have thorns on them that are at least an inch long. So you don't want to mess with them. And also to provide for snail habitat for the Moro shoulder-banded snail. And symbolic fencing was introduced. And I don't have a really good picture of it, but you can see it right there. They're metal rods that have an eyelet at the top, and you thread a cable through there, and it's somewhat inobtrusive. It's not like a big wall, and lets you enjoy the nature, but realize you should stay on the trail. The target species that were specified in this action plan are listed here. And you can pretty much say the bottom three here are gone. We don't have to worry about those. Veldgrass is pretty much a seasonal thing. In the spring, on the slope that goes down to South Bay Boulevard, there's a lot there. And often at the street ends where it comes in from vacant lots in Los Osos. But our problems now are the top three. The Cape ivy, which is a very vigorously growing plant and likes to grow up and just almost kind of smother into an oak grove. Smilax is usually a little lower to the ground, and the narrow-leaved ice plant. These you usually do not see anywhere from the boardwalk. They are in some of the deeper groves, and we are working hard to eradicate them. So in 2005, there was an extension made to the boardwalk, and it went into Rose's Grove. Everybody's pretty familiar. You've seen that photo before, probably, of the grove with a couple of benches in it. And for many years, that grove was used for fundraising activities. The concerts were in there, and after the forest was acquired, that was the one grove people were allowed to go into, kind of considered a sacrificial grove. And there was not a layer of leaves down like should be. It was just kind of bare sand. So rather than closing it, a boardwalk was proposed to protect the roots from further damage. And a person that was instrumental in getting that going was Ron Rasmussen, who was a long-time chairman of our board of directors. And what was important is that that was a wider space, so you could get groups in there. You could take school groups in there and whatnot. And it was large enough that you could turn a wheelchair around there easily. It wasn't a dead end and have to try and figure out how to back out. And I mentioned Rose Bowker because everybody goes, who was Rose? How did this person contribute? And Rose Bowker was involved early on in the acquisition of the Elfin Forest. She was probably one of the primary writers behind all those grants, and that was a whole heck of a lot of work. She was chapter president for 7 years, and along with another board member, Barbara Machado, they were probably instrumental in creating a financial advisory board to really look at the money and how to get it, and creating a good relationship with Shirley Otto, who is now Richard Otto's widow. He was one of the developers of the Baywood Park area. And because of her previous negotiations with the state that I talked about, of suits and countersuits and condemning the property, they realized that personal contact was needed. And so they drove down to Santa Barbara. I think one of them made some homemade preserves for her, gave her a little jar of jam, and created a relationship. And I think she realized how enthusiastic these people were, how passionate they were about saving this piece of property as a park. And she agreed to sell it to SWAP. Now, unfortunately, I've been talking about a whole lot of positive stuff. I do have to bring up something that is not so good. And I asked you to be please alert when you're in the forest. And if you see anything suspicious, to report it. That we've had people or persons taking trail guides, crumpling them up, and creating a bonfire in the middle of the boardwalk. Fortunately, that's not the way to burn the boardwalk, and it hasn't done anything more than just sort of scorch the surface, but you have to wonder. And we've had people go in with hatchets and slash up the bark on some of the lower groves down closer to the bay. And then we've had problems with people over the years camping. I can remember several years ago, 5 years ago, somebody camped under one of, I think it was Sienna View Outlook, because it's a big platform there, nice roof, we'll just move in underneath. And that one there was a camper, and they were hanging out their laundry on the symbolic fencing. And we've had people go in on bicycles and abandoned bicycles there. So if you see somebody going in with a bicycle, or if they've got a big camping pack on, be aware of that. And then in July, we had a rather serious fire in one of the oak groves. And had an engine come over from Morro Bay, one from Los Osos, had to lay hose down into this grove. You can see the smoke coming up there, and some fairly significant burning of some of the branches in that grove. The grove was not entirely destroyed, but two parts of it had significant amount of fire damage to it. So unfortunately, this is something that we're having to deal with. And there's always been minor vandalism for as long as there's been the Elfin Forest. As soon as the trail guide boxes went in, people would try and rip the lids off and whatnot. So it's not unusual, but it's something that happens to all public properties these days. So you may not know that there's been research that has been done in the Elfin Forest. That back in 2011, a maritime entomology professor from New York State had a son living in Los Osos, and he came for a couple of summers to study a variety of two special varieties of sand wasps. They're food of grasshoppers and the robber flies that tried to make off with it. And so this is a published paper in a biological journal, and very interesting. These wasps are like the size of my fingernail, very tiny, half-inch or less. Then in 2019, a master's student did a thesis on the difference between oak leaves in the Elfin Forest and oak leaves further inland. And what she found was that the nutrient content in the leaves themselves did not vary between the two locations, which you would think in sand they wouldn't have had the nutrients. But what they did find is that there was a difference in the substrate. And so when we're talking about substrate, we're talking about how firm the ground is. And so the inland sites were loamy or clay. And so if you're a big oak tree and you can put your root down very deep in something pretty solid, you can branch out really big and wide. However, if you put your roots down in a sand dune, that can be kind of shifty around, and you might just want to put your branches out more along the ground and not get so high. So that's what her deduction was, that the wind and the substrate were the most conclusive factors contributing to the pygmy form. And then coming up in 2025, Cindy Roessler, who is here, right there, she's affiliated with the California Bumblebee Atlas, And so she's working through getting all the permits that are necessary to do that. And we'll be looking at bumblebees next year. And what she does is she doesn't harm any bumblebees. She's going to net them and take pictures of them and release them again. So looking at some of the things that we have to do because of our Adopt a Park contract is conservation and revegetation. And what I mentioned a little bit before, how unique our biome is, that it's area that has had very little human impact on it. And we've got over 200 varieties of plants out there. We've got a fair amount of mammals, lots of insects, and all those things really rely on native plants. So it's a critical environment in this area. And one of the things that we do for conservation is in 2002, we got a grant from the National Estuary to put out mutt mitts and the trash cans for them so that the dog feces do not contribute to pollution in the bay. So that's one conservation thing. And then we've got our weed warriors. They meet the first Saturday of every month at 9 o'clock at the end of 15th Street if you're interested. Let's show of hands. How many weed warriors do we have here at the moment? Yeah, so they're a dedicated crew. They do the trail and boardwalk maintenance and the removal of the big four that I mentioned before. Over here, that is a narrow-leaved ice plant. And if that was spread out, it would probably be about 6 feet in diameter with all those leaves spread out on the ground. And the taproot for that thing is just as long as you see there. And we've taken out taproots that are a couple inches in diameter. This is smilax removal. You can't really see it, but that's what's going on there. And on the right-hand side, all those white bags are filled with veldgrass that were taken out at the 16th Street entrance into the Elfin Forest. And for education, we have the interpretive signs around the boardwalk, and they inform visitors of the history and the ecology of the area. And they've been there almost 25 years too, and probably we're looking at maybe doing a new theme in the future. Third Saturday, nature walks. These have been very popular. We get a guest speaker. Many of the same speakers come back year after year. Dennis Sheridan does mushrooms and fungi in February. I do butterflies in April. We have someone in the spring that usually does tracking in the sand. And then school walks with docents. And amazingly, some kids in Los Osos have never been to the Elfin Forest, which is a crime in my mind. And so we introduce them to nature and they learn about conservation. This is an area that we really would like to beef up a little bit. So if anybody is interested in being a docent, please consider that. And then other groups, if they're, we've had docents come down from Fiscalini and want to have a tour or whatnot. So other groups that contact us, we're glad to give them a tour. Our publications, that our stellar publication is the Oakleys, and that has been since 1986. It provides a tremendous historical and biological record of both FEMEF and the Elfin Forest. And it's available to you online. It's on our website. We are in the process of making a new website that will fix one of the problems because the early issues could be 6 pages long and each one is a separate PDF. Which makes it, so we're getting those compiled, and on our new website that won't be an issue. but it educates the public about conservation and currently is being published quarterly. So then we have our FEMEF brochure, little color trifold brochure, and we have the trail guide for the boardwalk, and that's been around since 2002. We distribute about 4,000 of those a year right now. And you have to consider that the locals don't pick it up, and a good portion of the visitors never see the little boxes. And so it's just a fraction of the people that are picking them up. And that was recently upgraded to a color trifold document because the previous one was 17 inches long, and if you downloaded it from the website, unless you had really long paper, you weren't going to be able to print it. So now it's easily printable for visitors before they come. And we have joined the digital age. So we have a website, we've got Facebook, we've got Instagram, YouTube, and even Yelp, because businesses can claim their Yelp website. And so we're sort of a business, so we could claim our site. And it helps to get our message out to what we want our message to be, because a lot of people come visit and they post things on Facebook and get the directions wrong, or they're posting for the wrong Elfin Forest. And so sort of in self-defense, we need to be in the digital age. So the volunteer opportunities are certainly there, and we are an all-volunteer organization. That if we are continued to do the kind of work that we've been doing for the last 40 years, actually, because I'm counting the 10 years that took it to buy the Elfin Forest before we got it, we really need to involve more people that really care about the Elfin Forest. So here's just a quick look of, I think we're starting to get some volunteers for the oak leaves, but we could really use docents for school walks. We will be updating. We used to have a pocket guide, a paper pocket guide, and we'll be folding that into the new website digitally, so people that like to look up species names and that kind of thing. We could use some more help with website development. Definitely could use more people on the board of directors. The more people you have, the better decisions you can make when you listen to all points of view. We really need someone for the events committee for doing this kind of event and doing the Oktoberfest. We haven't had a historian for a while. It would be nice to be keeping track of some of this information. And probably in the future, we're going to need to replace the interpretive signs on the boardwalk and replace the boardwalk. And so looking to have some grants written to raise some of those funds. So I'm going to put in a plug here that although we've only been around for 30 years, and it was 20 years before that, starting back with Emily Polk, that if she hadn't taken the steps that she did to save one piece of property and then spread it throughout the state of California, would we have had the Elfin Forest that we have today? And unfortunately, in this presentation, there really has not been time to even scratch the surface on all the people who have contributed to what we are today. And so I apologize to them. Many of them aren't with us anymore, but nonetheless, they have all done a fantastic job of contributing to the Elfin Forest. So in closing, here's a quote from Margaret Mead that Rose Bowker used frequently. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. So that's the end.